Super thrilled to be here. Got it. Super thrilled to be here. Thank you all. Excited to learn today. I had the privilege of introducing some people. I'm excited about that because I get to say nice things and I get to make a joke. But first, before that, we want to know a little bit more about you all. And so I'm going to share my screen. We're going to do a word cloud just to get a sense of who's in the room. I think we shared a little bit, but this will get a better sense. Okay, so for those of you who have not used Mentimeter, this is how you do it. You go to menti.com. I think you can see the instructions at the top and use the code 89395819. And so I'll give folks a second to get another tab up, go there, input that. But once you're there, we'd like to know who are you? And people show up in different ways on different days. And you might have shared a little bit more about your work life in the intro earlier in the chat. Feel free to share something different or share more about who you are in work or in life. This is just to get a sense of who's in the room. We have one more quick question after this, but I'm going to do it too. So let's go ahead and go. And I'm going to guess who's saying the different things. So menti.com. Any questions about this? Okay, researcher and Andy, fun advocate, parent, supporter, artist, cool, director. I can't guess. This is too much. It's too complicated. Was I right, Andy, with the one that I guessed? Okay, good. I got one right. I'm going to stop there. Early childcare supporter, student, fan of Andy's. That's my joke. Damn it. Okay. Californian. All right. Leader, researcher, parent, advocate coming up a lot. I like that. Director coming up a couple times. Organizer, educator, supporter, fundraiser, student. Let's give this another minute. Servant. I love it. Consultant, team member. Cool stuff. All right. Municipal government employee, some OST admin staff. Cool stuff coming up. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next quick question. But a lot of great folks in the room, a lot of different personalities. We got a dog jumping up right here. What do you feel when you think about statewide advocacy? So you should have it should just pop up the same thing. I think has changed slides. Go to slide, and you should see what do you feel.
There's a button down below that you just hit next question.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. What do you feel when you think about statewide advocacy? And this could be, you feel excited, you feel scared, you feel nervous, you feel overwhelmed, you feel like you don't know what to feel. But just get a sense of what are the feelings in the room? Daunting, necessary, power, yes. Money, I love it, yes. Essential, passionate, excited, determined, I love it. Windmill tilting, Republicans. Okay. Hopeful, needed, scared, excited, cool, frustrated. Yeah, this is cool stuff. I think I feel all of these words too. Gerrymandered, not for long, who knows. How loud can we be? Anxious, ignored. Oh yeah, that's a great one. Let's give it another minute because I think these are helpful to just sit with for a second. Kind of the range of feelings we're all feeling. Fun. Okay, I like it. I like it. Who said that one? Come off mute. Was it Andy?
That was me, Nathan.
Oh, okay. Okay, I wondered if it was you. I like it. Good for you.
It is.
Good. I love it. I love that you're bringing that to our space so early. Cool. Well, this is awesome. Thank you, everybody, for engaging and sharing kind of your own thoughts. Are these Menti word clouds able to be saved and shared? I think they are. So I will share them because I do think they're actually helpful, just as some grounding. And now I have the privilege, if I can find out how to get out of that screen, to introduce some pretty cool folks. Now, lots of you already know Andy Davey, and you probably know him in a lot of different ways. Andy is a funder, a researcher, a critical thinker, a skeptic, and an optimist. He is a partner, an evaluator, someone who thinks of systems and tries to learn about them from those closest to the work, but also someone who doesn't stop there. who keeps interrogating his role and the role of funders and making large-scale systems change a reality. The kinds of topics he learns about and supports are pretty wide, from after school and childcare to environmental justice, food, and arts. He is kind and gracious, and he has a really impressive beard. And Jennifer, many of you do not know, but she is really, really cool. Jennifer founded and for more than 2 decades led the Partnerships for Children and Youth, a nonprofit focused on expanding access to quality expanded learning opportunities for students pre-K through 12th grade across the state of California. During her tenure, she played an instrumental role in building public systems and investments totaling more than $4 billion annually that support quality after school and summer learning programs for millions of students. She was also an appointee of President Bill Clinton at the U.S. Department of Education, where she supported a lot of initiatives, including 21st century community learning centers. And Jennifer does this work with a value set that is pretty special. As accomplished as she is always seems to bring forward a grassroots, people-centered approach and embodies that the people doing the work matter, their voices and experiences are essential, and they are the experts and drivers of what policy and funding should look like. And so I'm so thrilled to get to learn from her today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Andy and Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for a really kind introduction. And just to piggyback off, Nathan, we're really, really lucky to have Jennifer with us today. So much wisdom and experience to bring to the table. So very excited to have her share her experience with us and engage in some discussion and dialogue. So we're going to do this in an interview style, as Becca mentioned, ask questions of Jennifer and let her kind of riff for a while. And you're welcome to add questions into the chat or stick up your hand if you want to interrupt us and get your question in there. That'd be great. So we want to just start off by asking Jennifer, could you tell us why did your organization start? How did you get started with this, and why was advocacy so critical to the work right from the get-go?
So, yeah, thanks for the question. And before I launch into that, I just want to say how excited I am to be talking to you all. This stuff really is incredibly fun for me. Nathan, I think that was the best introduction I've ever received in my entire life. So I'm glad you recorded it because I want to keep that. So, I also want to say that as someone who led an intermediary for a long time, who had no experience in the field, I never worked in a school, I never worked in an after-school program. I came from politics into government, into starting an intermediary. And everything I did was totally dependent on people doing the hard work every day in the field. And I learned very early on in my career that we could get nothing good done without really listening and representing the realities of what it takes to run programs for kids in often hard to serve places. And so that's just a really important, I think, lens to be in this work with. I also want to say up front that it's sometimes tricky to use the California example when you're talking to folks organizing in other states, because our investment is so big in California, and it's been a lot bigger than other states for a long time. But what I want to say about that is that, number one, it wasn't always that way. We started really from scratch, and it took 25 years to get to the place that we are now. I also want to say it's far from perfect. There's a lot of challenges with implementing programs in California. We still have, we're a huge state. We still have a lot of kids that aren't getting services. There's lots of things about the design of our funding that are problematic. It's a journey, but a really, really worthwhile one. And I do think that, through all the building that we did, there's, a lot to be learned, I think, from the experiences of other states, even if they seem really different from the one that you're in. So, going back to why we started, we started in the late 90s, shortly after the federal government began investing for the very first time through the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program. And I was working at the U.S. Department of Ed during that time on that program. But I had the honor of working in a regional office in California. So I got to really see it from the ground level rather than the Washington, D.C. level. And shortly thereafter, the state of California began investing in a small kind of pilot after-school program. I mean, California was one of the very first places that kind of dipped their toe in the water with state investment. And what we noticed being out in the regional office, really paying attention to this from a policy and implementation perspective, was that the way in which the state had designed this early pilot program was really, really problematic. They did it pretty differently from how the federal government did it. It had a lot of rules and regulations and constraints that made it really difficult for people around the state to actually access or utilize the dollars effectively. And we spent some time going around really listening to folks in schools and community-based organizations in high need communities in the region I was working with, and asking them questions about, like, are you going to apply for this new funding stream? You know, if you're not, why not? And we got a lot of feedback that the RFP is too fat and we can't afford a grant writer, or the daily rate they're offering us is not enough for us to even run a program, and the constraints around the hours of operation. I mean, there were so many things that were problematic. And it became really clear to me that the really well-meaning legislators who put this funding source forward at the time and got it passed had not thought through the details very well. And they hadn't really been talking to folks in the field. And therefore, we ended up with a program that had a lot of flaws. And this was around the time that I was winding down my time in the federal government, and realized that as investment in out-of-school time was starting to get more attention in our state, it was really critical that an entity was needed to be this kind of translator between the realities of running and implementing programs on the ground and decisions that were getting made at the state level by policymakers in the design. And so that's why we were created. You know, we decided to become that middleman, you know, then called an intermediary, to really be that translator, sort of representing the interests of the field with policy leaders in our state. And before then, you know, I had been pretty focused on regional level work, and really supporting folks in their local partnerships when they're implementing 21st Century and other federal programs at the time. But this experience really helped me understand how consequential the state level is. And I think that was one of the things I really wanted to say that's exciting about the organizing you're doing in Wisconsin, is that, you know, and this has been affirmed for me over a lot of years, you know, in our country, the state is the most consequential unit of government when it comes to policy and investment in programs for kids, public education, and beyond. The state has influence, obviously, over the things that it creates and funds, but it also has a lot of influence on how it uses federal funds, as you have experienced in a variety of ways. And so I really think if you're looking to growing and sustaining investment in out-of-school time programs, you really don't have a choice but to engage at the state level. It's critically important. I also think when you're good at doing this stuff at the state level, it has reverberating effects on your local work and on influencing federal policy as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jennifer. And so you mentioned, you know, it's been a long journey. When you first got started, you were already sort of plugged into what was happening in terms of funding and policy for out-of-school time work, and really figuring out how do we make it better and how do we get more funding. So how did you get started in terms of building relationships and connecting with folks? Maybe, and also maybe speak a little bit to kind of building relationships with policy leaders and kind of that elite level, but also kind of really fostering grassroots relationships too.
Yeah. So I was fortunate that when I entered the work, I had some pre-existing relationships with folks from the work I had been in before. But we basically, you know, I started with who I already knew, and I think this is where everybody can start and needs to start, is with your own universe and build on it. And, I was pretty assertive about, going to the people that I did know and asking for introductions to other people. And, one of our very first champions, for example, was a county level administrator who was on one of our first board of directors, and then also a mayor who I knew from, other work that we had done. And we just started asking for introductions. And I think it doesn't so much matter the position folks are in or the level folks are in when you start building out these relationships. What I learned early on, and I'm sure you all have experienced this also, is that folks in elected and policy roles, they all know each other. They all network with one another. They go to the same fundraisers and cocktail parties, and they love to make introductions. They love to show off all the people that they know. And so once we started asking for introductions, we realized pretty quickly, like, these folks actually love showing how important they are and introducing us to all sorts of important people. So we just got really assertive about that. And it had kind of a snowball effect. And so that really was how we started. And the other thing I would say about that is that, as you're developing relationships with policy folks, regardless of whatever the level is, we also learned over time how important it was to also get to know equally well, if not better, their staff. We invested a ton of time in building relationship with staff. There were a lot of instances where staff, whether it was, a local elected or a state level elected, often outlast their bosses, and they move around into different roles in the policy arena. And they're the ones who are really, especially at the state level, they're the ones really getting the work done. And they can also ruin your chances of getting anything done if you are not on their good side. And so, we paid a ton of attention to the relationships with staff as well, really honoring their time and the hard work that they do, and really getting to know them as people. And, and I think folks in the out of school time work don't need to be told that this is all about relationships. It's just the same in the policy world. It's really all about getting to know people and building trust. And I think one of the most important things we did in building trust with policy leaders and staff was to be a consistent, reliable source of information for them. And I think that a really important thing to keep in mind is that in building relationships with policy folks, you are always going to be the expert in the room. You are always going to be the person who knows the most about the subject that you're talking about. And they really value that. They really value that. And if you're not talking to them, probably nobody else is talking to them about the stuff they need to know about your issues, or somebody who's not as knowledgeable is telling them things, and you don't want to land in that place. And so I think I got a little bit off track with your question, Andy, but
no, that's all. Yeah, that's all good. It reminded me of something you said when you, Becca, Nathan, and I were kind of meeting to plan for this conversation, and you said a lot of times out of school time providers become sort of de facto staff members for legislators because they are so knowledgeable, and they're sort of constantly being tapped to explain this to me or to help me understand what's happening on the ground. I thought that was a really empowering message, and also correlates with what you said about relationships with actual staffers, that those are so critical as well. So maybe on that note, could you talk a little bit more about over the course of many years that you've done this work, how did you engage providers, and what critical role did providers play in this process?
Yeah. So we spent a lot of time cultivating relationships with providers so that we could understand what we needed to do in the policy arena. And early on, these relationships were more informal. There were folks initially that I knew through being a grants manager for the 21st Century program, and then later on, really going out and we did a lot of focus groups with providers around the state. We did a lot of surveying of providers around the state. We did a lot of site visits with providers around the state, and eventually created a more formal coalition of providers. So we had a more organized way of bringing providers together to both learn from them about what their challenges and struggles and needs were, but also starting to get them more engaged in the advocacy work. And, you know, I would say that it was definitely a process to get our providers consistently engaged in the state level advocacy. You know, some of them were already doing a fair amount of local advocacy, which you need to do if you're getting local funding. And then some were more nervous about it, but all of them were a little nervous about jumping into the state arena. And I think it was a combination of, you know, time constraint. You know, these are busy folks working hard every day running programs, which is no small thing. And I think there was also a level of intimidation about doing this at kind of a bigger level of government. They didn't think they necessarily had the skills, but you know, what we always told people was everybody who's in this work is already an advocate. You have to be in order to be running these programs. You're already an advocate. And it's just a matter of translating those skills into a slightly different arena. And so there were a number of things that we did pretty consistently over the years to get folks more comfortable and then subsequently excited about doing the state level advocacy. I mean, we did a fair amount of advocacy training with folks, just talking about the basics, which always included a lot of role playing for people. One thing we always did in our advocacy training, which I think was really effective, was rather than just us telling them things and going through some exercises, we always brought in a real live policymaker to be part of the training, to talk about, you know, the challenges they face in their roles. And sometimes we would bring in an elected person and sometimes we would bring in a staff person, to have some back and forth, like in real time with providers, and break down some of the misconceptions that people had in their minds, or the fears that people had in their minds. And that always really helped. And then, you know, we did a lot of kind of early handholding with folks, you know, in meetings with policymakers. We would do that together with folks. You know, we always provided folks with talking points. But what we found over and over again is, as soon as people started to do it, they really got into it and got excited about it. And as soon as we started to actually get some things done together, folks could really see the value. And there's nobody better at making this stuff fun than the out of school time folks. So, you know, when we started doing things like annual rallies and lobby days at our state capitol, they came up with the best ideas about activities to have there. And making that fun. And so
can you give us some examples of, can you think of some of those fun, cool things that were done?
Oh, yeah. So one year, when we were running a campaign on summer, it was called our Summer Matters campaign that we ran for a number of years. And we did rallies for about 5 summers in a row in the Capitol. One of our providers came up with an idea we brought 200 middle school kids one year. And they had this idea of giving the kids, I don't know if you remember the flip cameras that were popular for a while. We got a donation and gave every middle school kid a flip camera. And in every meeting that they were in with legislators, they filmed them and did a little interview with them on what was that legislator's favorite summer memory. And then the kids are always so bold, you know, and they would draw all these contrasts between, you know, like the beautiful memory the legislator had of their summer camp or going on vacation with their family or whatever it was, and then what summer's actually like for a lot of kids. And they turned it into this whole video montage that we used for all kinds of things. So that was one pretty cool one. Some of our providers, you know, who were based in the state capitol, recruited 2 different high school marching bands. And so we started weaving those into our rallies, which always got a lot of attention. So yeah, there were a bunch of things that were fun from year to year. And it's not easy getting folks to take the time to come to the Capitol. So again, once folks started to do this stuff, they really got excited about it, and also really started to see the value for young people and giving young people voice. And I think, that's something that is really important to weave in as you're going through. Number one, because kids are incredibly effective advocates. They really get listened to in a lot of these meetings, and it's such a great civic engagement experience for them.
I was just thinking of another question as you were talking about engaging providers and helping them get over some of the early hangups and then eventually getting excited. How would kind of much did folks across the state kind of engage and build relationships together, or were you sort of constantly that sort of glue that kept all the different localities sort of plugged in, or did you find a lot of kind of organic relationships, and was that really important across the state given how big geographies can be in California and Wisconsin?
Yeah, it was definitely a mix of both. And so, about a dozen years ago, we started, I mentioned this before, initially we communicated with providers kind of informally, but we are a really big state and needed to get more organized. And so we launched an entity called the California Afterschool Advocacy Alliance. And we wanted to give it a name that was different from the name of my organization, so it could be really an independent entity, but we staffed it behind the scenes and created a little bit of infrastructure around it. And that was a really great way to get more providers around the state engaged. And so we did our best to, be in charge of communication about, like, here's what's happening, in the policy and funding arena, here's what we're needing from you, here's tools, here's resources. But we're a huge state, and it wasn't possible for us to be doing all of the outreach or facilitating relationships amongst providers very frequently. I mean, we would gather providers basically twice a year. Once for our annual Capitol rally in the spring, and then once in the fall, we would bring everybody together in person, and we raised money to help support this financially, knowing it was not always easy for folks to travel. Once a year, we would bring folks together for a 2-day retreat to debrief on our work the past year and really talk about what worked, what didn't work, what do we need to do better, and then also look ahead and do some goal setting for the coming year. So we really only saw them as a group twice a year. And then the providers kind of naturally started building relationships with one another, on a kind of a local or regional basis. And that is easier or harder depending on the place. In Los Angeles, for example, which is obviously dense urban area, lots and lots of providers, they created kind of their own sub-entity and were kind of convening themselves and collaborating, and also building relationships focused on LA legislators. Way more difficult for our rural providers. And, a lot of California is really, really rural. And so we had to pay special attention to doing more outreach to those folks so they didn't feel totally alone. But we also had to step in sometimes and navigate the differences of opinion that would come up when we're all trying to do policy together, because a lot of the things that we were working on were going to land differently in a Los Angeles versus a Fresno, or far north at the Oregon border, completely different. And so our job really was to try to find policy solutions that were going to be positive for everybody. And that gets really, really, really tricky. But I think what was useful about having a facilitated table of providers from all corners of the state is that, we all agreed about some certain fundamental things that we wanted for kids in our state that were important to us. And I think mostly, sort of goodwill is created around that, and then you have to work out the details. But I think it's critically important to have an entity that doesn't have skin in the game helping to mediate and negotiate those details. And that was the role we played. We were never going to be the recipient of any of the state or federal dollars. Our money came from completely different places. And so it was really our job as an intermediary to be that sort of mediator in those circumstances. But then facilitating the networking amongst providers was really, really important. And I think part of what was helpful about that also is our folks in LA got to be in a room with the folks in the rural communities and learn about the unique challenges that they faced, which they just didn't really know, because that's not the setting they work in, and vice versa. So I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, really, really appreciate those insights. And it reminds me so much of some of the same dynamics in Wisconsin and of course across the country. And you mentioned needing to sort of tailor your message to different audiences based on their geography, or just knowing that different messages and different facts and realities will resonate differently. At the beginning of the call, when Nathan asked the questions, people weren't shy about saying, yeah, we're in a very polarized state, and the Republican Party completely gerrymandered the state legislature and is sort of has a at the moment really total control. And I imagine folks are thinking, oh, California, very different, very blue state. So what is there really parallels to Wisconsin? And we've talked about how actually, well, there are parallels. You still need to kind of build a broad bipartisan coalition. So can you talk a little bit about what that's like, trying to work across parties and work across ideologies and different worldviews for out of school time in particular?
Yeah, first I'll say, California is very blue now. It wasn't always true. We've had our fair share of Republican governors, and when we started out in this work, it was not a Democratic supermajority in California, so we really did need to care about the Republican members of the legislature and our state work. And so a few things. I think one is that the good news is that after school has tended to be a pretty bipartisan issue. If for example, while the federal funding hasn't grown massively over the years, it also has stayed pretty constant. It hasn't been the subject of partisan battles the way some, public education programs have been. And it tends to pretty consistently poll well in a bipartisan way. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that there's been a lot of attention on the safety element and the crime prevention element of programs. And the stance that we took on this as advocates was that we were not going to get overly hung up on one single message about why after school programs are important. We really adjusted our messages to the people that we were talking to based on their political affiliation or their views. For example, I've been in legislative meetings with Republicans in the California legislature who said to my face, well, why should the state fund after school programs? Because kids should be home with their mothers after school. So, I have to kind of keep a straight face and talk it through. And, I am not going to change that guy's mind about why the state is funding after school programs. So I would immediately shift to, yes, however, the streets in your city can be dangerous. And, if mom can't pick them up, then they need a safe place to be. And the studies show that blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we had a range of messages, and we also had a range of partners to help deliver those messages, because the messenger really does matter in this stuff. So, for example, we developed a great multi-year partnership with a nonprofit called Fight Crime, Invest in Kids, and they're national and they operate in a lot of states, and they've got a bunch of different names now, but they were a coalition of police chiefs, sheriffs, and victims of crime who advocated for early childhood programs and after school programs, because the research and the data are really, really clear that investments in those things reduce crime and create better outcomes for kids. And so they were a wonderful partner to us. And so we would send, rather than us going into a meeting, we would send a police chief into a meeting. And I think, these groups exist all over the place. And so in some cases, it was us trying to develop a relationship with a business leader, or a farmer. In some of our 4-H programs, did a great job of developing relationships with businesses in their area who could do visits alongside them or communicate. So I do think you have to be flexible. There are some advocacy approaches that are different from the one I took, where and issues where it's important to really stay true to your values and, try to all speak with one single message. But this is a case where I think we have the advantage of investing in after-school programs creates so many benefits for kids and families and communities. There's a variety of things that you can zero in on, I think, that speak to really any audience. And I think that's really important to consider in a partisan environment.
Yeah, thank you for those insights. So there's one more question that I really want to ask you, and then I want to open it up to the group. So folks, please start thinking about what questions you have for Jennifer, observations so far from what you've heard, and want kind of to think through how that might work in Wisconsin. So as you mentioned, this has been a long game, very much so. And could you talk a little bit about how do you keep the momentum going for so long, for decades? How do you keep the coalition going through highs and lows? And maybe, recently you've got this, just amazing big win of, $3.3 billion, I think it is, annually in the state budget for out-of-school time. But maybe mention some of the smaller wins along the way that really helped keep wind in the sails for the coalition.
Yeah, the smaller wins I think are incredibly critical and make a difference. The thing that I think is also important to say, like when you're looking at the scale things of California, but in this work in general, it's the small kind of unsexy policy stuff that can be more important, because the little details about how funding sources are designed can just make or break, the implementation side, and can make a provider's job easy or difficult. And so I would say over that 25 years, we spent a lot more time on nitty gritty behind the scenes policy stuff on, for example, we had big fights with our State Department of Education early on about how much time they were actually giving folks to respond to RFPs. I remember one year they put out an RFP for 21st Century that folks had 4 weeks to respond to, and they put it out between Thanksgiving and Christmas. It's like, really? So that's an extreme example, but that did happen. But our advocacy often was like, give people more weeks and adjust the timeline for the RFP, or other rules like, our summer funding. We had to fight for 2 years to get the state to allow our summer grantees to actually consolidate sites in the summertime, to allow like 2 school sites to combine their funding and offer the program at one community site, because that was better for families. Little things like that, that were, little words inside of a bill, huge difference in a community. So a lot of the work is really nitty gritty like that. And then there's like the big budget campaigns, which are a different thing, but it's tough to keep people energized year after year. For us in the intermediary, this was our job. Like, this is what we do every year. And, we kind of live for this stuff, and, we get through it. But for the providers who, again, are busy running programs every single year, when they're not seeing immediate progress on things, it can be really hard. And the example I like to use for this was one of the campaigns that we ran several years before the pandemic was called the Save Afterschool campaign that we launched with our coalition. And this campaign launched because the way our state funding is designed in California, it's a daily per child rate that the state funds. And it had not been increased in a decade. And cost of living was going up. And then on top of that, California passed a pretty aggressive minimum wage increase law. And so we were facing this situation where, within about a 3-year period, a lot of our providers across the state, like the math wasn't going to add up anymore. They weren't going to be getting enough to run a program to actually pay staff. And we were going to experience like a massive shutdown of after school programs across the state because of this. And so we got everybody together and said, we need to turn this is not just a regular advocacy thing. We need to have a campaign. So we called it the Save After School campaign. We got organized. We did a bunch of materials, launched all our activities. And the first year we went to try to get more money, we failed. But we said to everybody, all right, this was the first year. This is a really tough ask to the legislature because we were asking them for more money, not for serving more kids, for serving the same number of kids, but just giving more money to each program. And that's not an easy political ask in a tight budget environment at the time. The second year, we were successful. We got another handful of $1 million in to get the rate up by, I think it was $1 or something or other, for all the programs. Third year, we went at it again. We got nothing. And after that third year, a bunch of our providers came to us and said, can we take a break from this next year? We need to regroup. We've got all this stuff on our plate, and there's a lot folks have to do. We're asking them to send text messages. We're asking them to come to, a rally in the Capitol. We're asking them to host site visits. We're asking them to come to meetings. It was really tough to convince them that we needed to go back another year, the next year. And because we knew that in order to get stuff done, first of all, nothing happens overnight. And in order to get stuff done, you really have to be consistent and persistent. And over a lot of years of this work, we had something in front of the legislature almost every single year. Some years we were successful and some years we weren't. Some years they were big things and some years they were small things. But it is really important to be there every single year so that you are building relationships, building awareness about your issues. Even in a year when you lose, you have won because you have gotten your issues in front of more people and you have continued educating people, building momentum, building awareness, all of that. And so we really had to push folks to say, I know we lost last year. I know you're tired, but if we take a break, we may never get this done. So we had to rally, and we tried to adjust what we were asking of folks. And so, and we had lots of conversations with our providers about this, and they said, we don't want to get emails from you once a week. We'd rather get, like a more consolidated email from you every 3 weeks, and only ask us for something when you really need it. And we want you to do more of these other things. And we said, okay. So we had a lot of back and forth around adjusting that. But we pushed forward. And then in that fourth year, we got some more money. And then the pandemic happened and the world blew up. But I do think that consistency and persistence is really critical. And do not get discouraged when you don't get something done, because it is a long game. And celebrate the really small things, because they all add up. I mean, I can attest they really add up over time.
I really appreciate that message about commitment, and of course your successes are clearly a testament to that. And yeah, that's something I've just noticed in general in a lot of the convening and conversations that we have is kind of getting over that hurdle of getting people to realize this is a long-term commitment and it can really pay huge dividends if you stick with it and you're doing it year after year. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for all of that knowledge and information and stories and wisdom. I want to open it up to the group here. We got about 7 to 10 minutes for kind of big group Q&A, and then we're going to do a little bit of small group breakouts to give people a chance to dialogue over what they've heard from Jennifer and think about where do we go from here in Wisconsin. So I see in the chat, Betsy actually put you put a question in there for Madison Community Foundation folks. So I'll give a quick answer to that and then parlay it over to Jennifer with a question. So in terms of Madison Community Foundation's role, it's a very good question. I think we see ourselves primarily as a funder. We do try to be a kind of convener to bring people together in these sorts of contexts, and we're kind of figuring out could there be ways to be a little bit more intentional about some of this work over the long haul. So we're kind of figuring it out. Sorry for the vague answer, Betsy, because we're not quite sure exactly how this is going to look over the long haul. But I would say more squarely in the intermediary space is clearly most here at a local level. And then we also have on the call Randy and Stan from the Wisconsin Afterschool Network, which is currently the sort of statewide entity that is doing some of this work. And I think the question for us, for Nathan, Rebecca, and I, as we've been sort of thinking about what's our role here in the Madison area, are there other intermediaries around the state, or are there organizations that could serve as those kinds of local intermediaries, and could we kind of build a network of local intermediaries in addition to working with WAN, the Wisconsin Afterschool Network? So lots of unanswered questions, but what I want to throw to you, Jennifer, is could you talk a little bit about the role of your funders, especially maybe some of the local funders, even community foundations in California? Were they big supporters of this work, and did they play a role sort of beyond the check, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and one quick thing I'll say on the prior topic is that we have multiple intermediaries in California. We are not the only one. We were around first. I mean, our state after school network was created after the Partnership for Children and Youth started, but we have a very collaborative relationship with. We actually have 3 statewide out of school time intermediaries in California. And we all leverage one another because none of us can do the work on our own. It's way too big a lift. So, you know, our after school network and the other intermediary, the California School Age Consortium, are like executive team members of our coalition. They help fund the work. And we really try to kind of carve out roles and responsibilities and leverage where folks have strengths, et cetera. So I think having multiple folks joining forces on this work is really important. You just have to figure out the coordination. For funders, over our history, we have primarily been funded by private foundations. We intentionally never sought and never took money from our state Department of Ed because we sometimes had to advocate with our state Department of Ed. And I sometimes think perceived conflicts of interest can be more damaging than actual ones. And we really wanted to remain as neutral as possible and really stay out of the state funding game and really situate our job as advocating for state policy and resources for our providers around the state. So we never took state money. We did ultimately do some contract work with districts around technical assistance. But most of our funding came from private foundations and a universe. It's a combination of local foundations and statewide foundations, and in a couple of cases national. But we had some statewide foundations in California that are focused on systems and policy work. And then we had a handful of community foundations from across California that supported the work. And that was not always easy, but we would have to convince them to support us as a statewide entity, knowing that our work was going to make a difference in the community. And we would often have our providers really try to make that case with us, that we're situated in that community, even though we weren't based there per se. And I think the difficult thing always in this work is that there's a lot of foundations that just aren't open to funding advocacy. But the fact that, and we're, as an intermediary doing advocacy work, we were very careful to track our actual lobbying time, and lobbying, there's a very specific legal definition for it. I think it's actually really important to do some training on this with folks who are getting into this work because it makes a lot of people nervous. when you really break it down, so much of the work that you are doing and going to be doing falls into the category of policymaker education. You know, when you're hosting a site visit, you know, when you're talking to a staffer or a policymaker about the work that you do and sharing your opinion about things, that's all policymaker education. It is not lobbying. There's no prohibition against it. It's really only lobbying when you are making a very, very specific ask for something. And that, you know, that happens sometimes, but the majority of the work is in policymaker education. And some foundations get that and understand the critical importance of the advocacy work. And some have cold feet about it. So, you know, we just had to get creative about that over the years. And we had a handful of really consistent funders, some that went in and out. But we tried to make it our job to worry about that part. And, you know, one thing I didn't focus a lot on, although I think there's potential for this, it just wasn't my area of strength, was, you know, around more private and corporate fundraising, because there's a lot of visibility opportunities with this work. If you can find the right corporate partners, you know, and people you'd feel comfortable having their logo on something. You know, we did that once in a while, but I think that's something that can be explored.
Thanks. That's really interesting, really helpful context. Okay, we can take maybe one more question for the big group if there's one out there. Otherwise, we'll move into the small group breakout sessions for about 10 minutes or so, and then come back together. So any other questions out there from the crowd? Feel free to unmute or stick it in the chat. All right, folks are either feeling shy or just don't have something burning right now. So Becca just put in some instructions in the chat. So she's gonna assign everyone to a breakout here in just a moment. I see people dropping off, so that's okay if y'all have gotten your fill. Appreciate those of you who are willing to stick around and chat some more. So as Becca said, it's gonna be very informal. The premise is really just, reflect on what you heard today and where you think we're at here in Wisconsin, and where we might take some of these insights from Jennifer to start the work. So introduce yourself when you get into the group, and yeah, if someone could volunteer to just give a little bit of a report back here. So we're going to go to 11:41, and Nathan, Becca, Jennifer, and I are also going to be in the groups just to listen in and be part of the conversation. So Becca, take us away.
And then, Andy, I think because you and I are hosts, we'll have to pick where we want to go. Can
Okay.
you go to room 4 and I'll go to 2?
4, sure. Yep. Okay. And it looks like Randy and Stan, you guys are still in the big group. Did they get assigned or just haven't joined yet? Okay. Yeah, why don't you guys go ahead and join if you can, and we'll see you in a little bit. All right. Thanks, Becca.
Yeah.
And
Aha,
yeah.
Andy will guide us.
Hey guys.
We were just wondering if we were waiting for other people, Andy, or it was just could be essentially the 4 of us.
Yeah, I think there was one other person, Stan from One, that was assigned to the group, but might have stepped away. I'm not sure. So we can just get started. I'm gonna, let's see. How do you all feel about this being recorded? I can pause it. We were not intending for these great breakout rooms necessarily to be recorded, but does anyone have strong feelings about it?
I would prefer not to, but I can just go off camera if you want to.
No, I'll pause the recording again. And then let's see. So basically, just want to give folks a chance. Any specific insights, observations that came out of your small group that you want to share with the big group, and then I'm going to hand it over to Nathan to kind of close us out. Maybe I'll just start. Really good but short conversation in our group. Two takeaways for me was that there is a desire and an understanding of a desire to participate in this work and an understanding of how critical it is, but limited capacity for providers. And I think that's where funders really need to step up and pay folks to do this work, whether that's the intermediaries or even some staff time for providers. And that's a message I think we need to spread across the state. And then another interesting insight was that camps across Wisconsin could be a sort of a very wonderful untapped resource to really engage at a deep level on this. And for me, maybe a way also to kind of bridge some of those rural urban divides. So those are insights from my group. Other groups want to share?
I can share what we discussed in our group. Nathan, Allison, Alicia, and I sort of each shared a little bit of what we had been thinking about, Jennifer, based on what you had talked about. And Alicia mentioned, she's with BASE, that she has some board members who are really gearing up. So it sounds like some of this work is starting to happen on an individual organization level, but we don't have that collective voice happening yet. She has some meetings that a board member scheduled for her. Alicia mentioned that the Wisconsin Afterschool Network is sort of working on building these like awareness and abilities to advocate around for small organizations and staff. And one sort of question that came up also, maybe Jennifer, you can speak to this, is how we're enlisting the support of parents also, not just the organizations, but how we have a louder voice with the support of parents. And that sort of brought to my attention, right? This takes a long time. This is a process of like 5 to 10 years. And some parents are only like directly impacted by childcare for 5 to 10 years. They only have a kid who's in these programs. How do we maintain that conversation? And you talked a little bit about like keeping the ball rolling. How does that expand? Like not just for the organizations involved, but for the people impacted.
Yeah, I mean, quickly on the parent piece, I mean, I can't say that we did enough of that or did it particularly well, but I think it's really, really important. We started doing more of it during our Save After School campaign because that was such a tough budget campaign and it required more grassroots. And we had to find some easy, efficient ways for our providers to capture parent voice. And there's a lot of technology now that can help with this. So for example, we found a funder who was willing to help us purchase the texting technology that campaigns use. So our providers were able to send out messages to their families to say, click on this link and like this message will go directly to your representative. It's all like really easy if you have the right technology. And that was one way that was sort of like low effort for people to get more parents involved because it's not easy. But I agree, it's really important and that there are some efficiencies you can get for folks who want to do that. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for that, Jennifer and Emily. From the other 2 breakout rooms, if there are still people left, things you would like to share.
I don't want to speak for my breakout room because I'm talking too much.
I can do that. We talked about the hyper-competitiveness of funding in Madison in particular amongst our organizations. And then we also talked about like who heads up being the one voice. It sounds like the other group talked about too. And actually, Jennifer had some ideas about a spreadsheet of people who know specific legislators or have relationships with people, because we do continuing that discussion about relationship building and how important that is.
Great. Thank you, Betsy.
I'll just add that I think an important thing that came up, there was a question that came up about, like if we're doing relationship building now, like, where does that go? Like before this whole thing is more organized, and my response to that is that, all the relationship building that's happening now, keep at it and do more of it. And, the spreadsheets and the organizing of it all will come. But though, don't wait until this whole thing is organized to start on that.
That's really helpful, Jennifer. That's a conversation that we've been having in my organization. So I appreciate hearing that advice of we don't need to wait on that. We can keep moving. Our group talked about hearing some things that really alleviated some of our concerns about working in the political climate that exists in Wisconsin right now and kind of touching on those divides. I think we all really liked the concept of having kind of a plethora of different reasons why OST programs are important and really tailoring that audience and using providers' voice in different areas of the state to talk to their business community and their legislators makes a lot of sense and kind of helps alleviate some of that. Are there a bunch of people in Madison saying this is what we think is good for the rest of the state? So excited to continue that work to build those connections across the state. And then we also talked about the idea of kind of building blocks or incremental growth over time to be able to really see those successes. I think, when we look at beyond the classroom and we think that amount of money was amazing, if we could just have that continued, that feels like a really large ask. I mean, it would be amazing, but it feels like a really large ask. But to think about how are we doing the work to set ourselves up for that and changing, are there some small changes in the way DPI funds are distributed that would help? That's our Department of Education, would help more providers access those funds. Is that a step, and kind of taking those steps along the way helps us to feel more confident in our path moving forward, as opposed to there's this big ask somewhere down the road and how do we get there?
Awesome. Thanks, Becca. Jennifer, do you have any sort of final thoughts before we kick it over to Nathan to close up?
Well, I would say on the state pandemic funding that is out there now, that's flexible and people I think are really appreciating. There are a number of states that are organizing to try to get their state to invest in some continued version of that, not necessarily at the same level, which may not be possible in every state, either financially or politically. But I wouldn't take it off the table. And I think one thing that needs to be done there is to clearly articulate what is valuable about that kind of money and the difference it has made for kids. How can you document that? And it doesn't need to be a big fancy study. It can be, a compilation of data that folks around the state have collected on what they have accomplished, how many more kids were served, stories, on the difference it made for a particular kid or family, and putting that stuff together and really trying to tell a story of the difference that kind of money made. I think the investment in doing that will really pay off, regardless of kind of the how or the when you decide to ask for state money. And I think time is of the essence around that. Like, while this pandemic relief money is on policymakers' minds, and also, I don't know where your state is in spending down that money. A lot of states are asking for extensions on spending that money. I would check in on that. If there's ways to extend that money out and buy yourself some more time to start doing some awareness raising and communication on the difference that money makes. But I think that's really important to be documenting why it matters with some specifics. And again, it doesn't have to be scientific. We never did any big studies, evaluations. I had no patience for that stuff, the cost of it. And there's no policymaker that is going to sit and read a big report. They just won't. It is way more powerful to show up with some stories and like a little bit of backup data. And there's a bundle of data that already exists in this field that shows after school programs work. So just use what is already out there in your arguments. Don't waste your time on doing huge things.
Good advice, and for someone who is supposedly an evaluator, a good
Sorry.
reminder. No, I think you're spot on there. A lot of times we get a little over obsessed with the need for more research when actually we got plenty to work with. So I'm gonna kick it over to Nathan, but before I do that, I just want to say thank you so much to Jennifer. If we could all give her a little round of applause for joining us and sharing so much with us. So thank you, really appreciate it. So all right, over to you, Nathan.
Yeah, I echo every time I have the privilege of hearing Jennifer speak, I take a lot of notes and feel energized and excited. After we raise our first $1 billion, we're gonna create the Jennifer Peck and Nathan Beck Roadshow. We're gonna go on the road, so it'll be a while.
Excellent.
Aspirations, right? Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate it, and just want to kind of tee up a couple of the next steps that we're thinking. Again, we're not totally sure where all of this is going, but we know that there's energy and need, and so we're thinking about it. And I think we do also recognize that this does need to be resourced and staffed and aligned with other statewide efforts. And so I think those are things that we're really critically thinking about, because it's a side project for a lot of folks right now. And to, I think, actually get where we want to get, it can't just be a side project. It has to be a focus. So we are thinking about that, and that is going to be a big topic that we think about between now and the end of summer and forever, probably. And speaking of that, anybody that wants to join in, that has ideas, that has interest, feel free to reach out to Andy, Rebecca, or I. And we're really happy to continue those conversations and think with you. We do have a couple things we're thinking about as kind of follow-up. In June, we would love to have kind of a more social gathering in person, picnic style, where we're able to continue some of these conversations, but also maybe think a little bit more critically about structure and about staffing and resourcing and what that could look like. And what people actually think is a good structure moving forward, and our role as mostly Madison folks in a statewide effort. So we'll have a social there. In July, during Summer Learning Week, we were potentially working on having some elected officials. We did a mini version of this last year. Some elected officials and funders do some site visits. And so I will be in touch with many of you on that. I think we're really good at the local level. Mayor's down, it has been for a while. And once the mayor's in, it shouldn't be that hard to get some statewide elected folks. So we're going to practice some. We're going to stretch ourselves and invite some people that we haven't invited before. You want to get on the bus with the mayor, visit some cool programs, come with us. So that'll be coming up. And then MOST has an annual conference, which many of you know about, on August 30th. We end with our awards, which is always a feel-good, enjoyable time. We will likely have local, state, and federal elected officials presenting on a panel from 3 to 4. I think very much the Jennifer style of have them share their advocacy ideas, but also let's have an opportunity to continue to learn from them and push them. So August 30th, right before our awards, we will feed you if you come, as we do. It's free. So MOST conference on August 30th will be kind of another thing, and I'm sure there'll be lots of other things in between, but just wanted to give kind of those heads up of a couple directions we're moving. Feel free to reach out with any questions, ideas that you all have, but really appreciate you all for making space and time on a beautiful Friday, and really looking forward to being in this work with you over the next several years. Any last words? Andy? Anyone?
Good luck and have fun.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. See you later.
Everyone.
Thanks for coming. Oh yeah. Alicia's it was super cool to get to meet Alicia. She's doing an $11 million capital campaign in Fort Atkinson. Having her board members read out to legislators. So it's oh, that's really cool.
That's awesome.
And she's and there's nobody else doing this. And I are we part of a statewide,